Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. We are delighted on this edition of Revealing the Truth to welcome in an old friend of mine, David Dolan. David was a Jerusalem-based author and journalist, born and raised in the United States. He lived and worked in Israel for some 30 years. And after studying at Bible college in his native Pacific Northwest, he graduated in broadcast journalism in 1976. He worked for Moody Radio in their Spokane affiliate. His Mideast media career began in 1982 when he was the news director at the Voice of Hope Radio in war-torn southern Lebanon. From 1984, he reported from Jerusalem for the Washington, D.C.-based IMS News Network and later for CBN's Middle East Television in Jerusalem. He became a regular reporter for the CBS radio network in 1988 and during the first Palestinian uprising. He also covered the massive immigration of Soviet Jews to Israel, the 1991 Gulf War, and many other stories during the 90s. He's a frequent guest on many radio and television programs in the United States and elsewhere. He writes a regular opinion column for the popular WorldNet Daily website. He began authoring the monthly Israel News Digest for the group Christian Friends of Israel in 1986. Hundreds of articles, many books, well-known international speaker, someone that I first met in person on a cruise ship to Alaska as we were both there for a benefit for Israel. He is the author of Holy Wars for the Promised Land, The End of Days, Israel in Crisis, What Lies Ahead. And we are delighted to have David Dolan on our program with us. Thank you so much, David, for joining us.
Good to be with you, Rabbi Eric. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again. So you have moved back to Idaho, to the region from whence you came. I think you were in Washington for a while. Now you're in Idaho. And what's been happening since you've left Jerusalem and come back to the States?
Well, basically, I was having trouble getting a new working journalist visa in Israel about and I was living there, or my legal ability to be there was to go back to work full-time on radio, and the Salem Broadcasting Network approached me to do that. But it would mean 24/7 news again, and I've just gone over the 60-year hump and have to be ready in the middle of the night to run off and cover a terror attack or, anything that happens at any time when you're covering a whole country for a network in the United States. And of course, right, as you mentioned, I did that for CBS for many years. So I just didn't feel that was the Lord's calling. So I elected to return to the States, but I still go back to Israel from time to time. I was there for a month in March of 2015. I spent a lot of time with my close friend Lance Lambert, a Bible teacher and scholar there. He was on his last days of life, so I went over mainly to see him. I was supposed to be taking a tour there this April, co-hosting a tour there, but because of all the trouble in the region, the ongoing war in Syria and the threats with Iran, etc., we just had a lot of people very hesitant to go at this time, so we decided to wait and put that off till later. But I will be going back probably later this year. I may do some volunteering at the Christian Embassy with their media department, and I'm still doing some writing about, of course, Israel and the Middle East. I'm about to put out a new assessment of the world situation and how it relates to Israel and the United States, right, and the new government in the States and that. So I'm working on that right now, and I continue to do weekly radio reports on Israel for Jimmy DeYoung for his weekly program. So keeping busy, but semi-retired as well, and I built a place up here in Idaho and enjoying a little bit of time to read and sort of catch up on friends and some other things as well.
Good. But never without keeping your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the Middle East.
Well, that's right. I mean, I lived 33 years there, most of my adult life there. I would say probably 2/3 of my closest friends are still in Israel. So I'm in regular communication with them. And, every day I'm watching on television the news reports. I was thinking just yesterday how wonderful that on my direct TV in Idaho, there's a channel that carries Israel TV's news broadcasts in English throughout the day. So I can check on that and keep keep really as informed as if I were there, frankly, with the internet and the newspapers, Israeli papers online and that sort of thing. One can keep pretty well informed today, and I try to do that because, of course, it's very important to me personally, but also for the purpose of doing this, of commenting and commentarying on what's happening.
So what's your take? What's your take on what's happening? What do you see prophetically, the landscape? What's next on the horizon from a biblical perspective?
Well, that's being debated by different Bible scholars and prophecy scholars. On the prophetic realm, there's a lot of people that are seeing the events in the Middle East as possibly leading up to the Gog and Magog invasion spoken of in Ezekiel 38 and 39. We certainly see Russia coming in to fill a void that was created, I believe, by the Obama administration. Decided not to, and instead he didn't do anything militarily. Some other things happened, and of course, especially our pulling our troops out of Iraq completely. They've now been returned there. My niece's husband is among U.S. Air Force pilots. It's now over there again, actively involved in the combat against ISIS. But that produced a vacuum. Russia, Vladimir Putin walked right into it. I should say rushed right into it.
Right.
And they are busy building their base in Syria, their air base and their sea base there, and increasing their forces dramatically. And of course, they have an alliance with Iran. Persia, mentioned as one of those powers that invades. Personally, though, Rabbi Eric, I don't believe that's the next prophetic event. In one of my books, I explain why. I note very clearly that at the end of the Ezekiel invasion, the Gog and Magog invasion, it says that the entire nation of Israel will turn to the Lord. They will all recognize him. He will restore all relations with them entirely.
Right.
They will see him. He'll see them. And he will restore all the remaining Jews around the world, it says in Ezekiel 39, to the Holy Land at that time. Well, if that were to happen next, we all know that read the Bible, that there's a tribulation period at the end of time. There's an antichrist, a world ruler that will come and that will apparently even deceive at least a portion of Israel as well as the rest of the world. So how Israel could see God and all of that and that happen and then fall back into this period of the Antichrist is confusing to me. So I think that's later. However, I do believe we are seeing the formation probably of another major conflict in the Middle East. It may well involve Russia, but I think it's more likely to be a direct clash between Israel and Iran that now with the new Trump administration, the United States may support. And of course, even this week we had a word from the new administration that Iran is on warning of possible trouble ahead from the states if they continue to violate this treaty that President Obama and others, that it's not actually a treaty, but this accord that was signed. We'll be seeing that in the Gaza Strip, and the Israeli military just announced on Wednesday that Hamas has now restored all of its military strength that it had before the 2014 war. So they, and that of course largely via Iran, sending them new weaponry and coming in from Egypt and the smuggling. So I think a more localized but potentially very devastating war could be on the horizon. And I know many people in Israel are sensing this, and it may be tied in with other actions elsewhere, in particular if Vladimir Putin does decide to invade the Balkan states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which looks very possible and very imminent, in fact. And I have a close friend, an Israeli friend, works for a Lithuanian company, shipping company. In fact, they go out on cruises like you and I did up to Alaska, but they're in the Baltic Sea, and they are expecting at any minute possible war there. And of course, Ukraine's heating up again as well. So all of that may dovetail into a new Middle East crisis involving Israel much more directly than they've been involved in the war to the north in Syria and the other conflicts raging all around them in Yemen and other places.
Do you really see Iran getting directly involved? Do you see them getting involved through the proxy state of Lebanon, with Hezbollah being the hands and feet of Iran?
I think it will all depend on whether such a conflict, if it comes, involves Israeli action against Iranian sites. If indeed it begins, let's say, with an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program, then obviously we can expect from Iran itself a major response, rocket attacks, and from their ships and possibly other means as well. Hezbollah either way would be involved. But if it's not that, if Iran just wants to start trouble, if they want to get back at the United States for this travel ban or anything else, they could just start it via Hezbollah and try to keep it a more limited conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. But I'm sure you know, Rabbi Eric, that the Hezbollah forces are extremely strong. They're considered among the top 10 military forces on earth, even though they are not a government's force officially. They are not the Lebanese army. There is such a thing. They're a paramilitary force, but a very powerful one, again, due to Iran's sending them copious amounts of weapons, and Russia has as well, and others, but mainly from Iran. And then Hamas would probably get involved in such a thing. So it could be either a more localized conflict or a larger conflict, but that is a very strong possibility with Israel, very worried about what Iran is doing. And, Prime Minister Netanyahu making it very clear how much he opposed the deal with Iran. And now that President Trump has said the same thing, we may see a different tact entirely.
You know, if it goes the route of Lebanon being engaged, Syria being somehow involved either through through ISIS, we look at Iraq, Jordan, northern Saudi Arabia, northern Egypt, it does kind of lean towards those people group named in Psalm 83. So those Arab-Muslim confederacy on the borders, because they're specifically not mentioned in the Ezekiel 38-39 coalition. So even logically, prophetically and logically, it would seem that if they're not mentioned, they would obviously be mentioned. If you've got these Sunni Muslims on the massing on the borders of Israel, that they would be engaged, but they're not mentioned. Is that God's way of saying no one knows the time and the hour, or is that God's way of saying, hey, pay attention, I haven't dealt with Edom yet, I have to deal with Edom, I have to deal with Esau's descendants, I have to deal with Ishmael's descendants, and I have to deal with Lot's descendants, because I said I would?
Well, I was one of the first authors to write about the Psalm 83 prophecy. I do believe it is also a prophecy of the end times in my 2000 book, Israel in Crisis, but I began speaking about it before, and I spoke about it at Dallas Seminary, and I said that I believe there's at least two major wars involving Israel in the last days, one being the Psalm 83 coalition of Arab Sunni forces, as you say, that conspire together, it says, to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. It appears that they, in fact, are the ones that get devastated, is hinted at in that psalm, and it's spoken of, I believe, in Isaiah 17 and other places as well. So I do think that is upcoming and probably will precede that. I said that at Dallas Seminary, and Dwight Pentecost, the great Bible prophecy scholar, was there on the podium, came up afterwards, and he said, I've come to that conclusion in recent years as well, that Zechariah 12 is speaking of two wars, one a more localized Arab attack in verse 2, and then the next it says the world will come against Israel. That would be a later on, well, we call it Armageddon. I believe Gog and Magog will probably be a part of that as well. However, there could well be other smaller wars, as it were, before that. I don't see the Arab coalition ready, and the reason is Jordan. Amman is mentioned by name, Amman, and of course it was a people group then as well, and it's mentioned in other tribes that are listed there, other powers, as you said, and we still have a pro-Western, pro-Israel, in a sense, government there with King Abdullah ruling, but we know his rule is very tenuous. We know that thousands of ISIS fighters have come in with the refugees from Syria and are in the camps there. We know the Muslim Brotherhood is very powerful there, and so one of these days, I believe the Jordanian government will be overthrown, the peace Israel will be abrogated, and that will be approaching that Psalm 83 war. So I don't think that's ready yet. Also, Iraq involved, and they're still pro-Western, although ties are tightening again after this travel ban. But I think we may and then later, Israel would be weakened in such a conflict, no question, if massive amounts of rockets were used, probably quite a few casualties. And then later, this Sunni Arab attempt to wipe them out, probably at that time, Damascus will be destroyed, as Isaiah 17 says, or that could happen in this separate war that I'm talking about involving Iran and Israel and Syria. And Hezbollah, and of course Syria and Hezbollah are close allies, the Syrian regime, obviously, the Iranian-backed regime there. So that's it's something to watch, but I do think the next major biblically prophesized conflict to look for is indeed the Psalm 83 one.
Yeah, I see that as well. Then I see the War of the Second Seal, Revelation 6, 3, and 4. The Beast campaign to rule the world, Revelation 13, 5, and 8. Then the campaign of Armageddon. And then, of course, Satan's last stand, Revelation 27 through 10, that ushers in the 1,000-year reign. After the 1,000-year reign. But the way that Yeshua presented this was there are going to be wars and rumors of wars. Not every war is specified in the Bible. We don't find the Korea War. We don't find the Spanish-American War. These are the prophetic wars that give us benchmarks in time to say that, okay, we could actually see war being defined as the First and Second World War. That was the first time the world was at war. And is that a starting point of a biblical timeline that then says then what came after that was, and World War II was really an extension of World War I, so that's one war. Then you have Israel becoming a nation in 48, the reunification of Jerusalem in 67, this is the Jubilee year, and quite interesting, in Leviticus 25, God talks about the redemption of the land in the Jubilee year, when it would come back to God, to its original owners. So I can see the impetus behind the relocation of the embassy, even though it's been the law of the land since 1995, the actual execution of it, moving it to Jerusalem, would be a fulfillment in certain people's minds until the fullness of the Gentiles. That would be the sealing blow, because then Jerusalem would be recognized as the capital, and once America recognizes it as the capital, the rest of the world either has to follow or square off with us. And because, and this is one of the confusing factors I struggle with, is an attack on Jerusalem by Islam would be antithetical to their ideology. Now, even though it was the battleground of the war, we were looking at gunfire then. We were not looking at missile fire then. Today, troops on the ground would be replaced by missile and rocket fire and drones and things like that. And the possibility of the Dome of the Rock being a casualty is pretty high in any kind of military air attack.
Well, that's true, and I lived for the last 12 years of my 33 years in Israel. I lived just a half a mile from the Dome of the Rock Shrine and the Temple Mount, just south of the Old City. Beautiful view of the entire Old City and the new part of the city as well, but the Mount of Olives and Hebrew University behind that.
Right.
And I do think that it's really the safest place in Israel from a missile attack, because, as you say, that would be the last place they would aim a rocket at. Now, of course, rockets don't always land where you aim them, but they've gotten better and better over the years at delivering them where they want, Hamas as well as Hezbollah. But I think they would avoid hitting any of East Jerusalem. Of course, it's not just the Dome of the Rock Shrine. There's also about 200,000 Muslims.
Right, and the Wazir is right there across from the Pool of Salam. So
it seems a bit silly to say that you're defending Islam by killing hundreds of thousands of Muslims. But then again, of course, in the Islamic faith, if you die a shaheed, a martyr, you go straight to paradise. So they would justify it in that way, as they do so many other civilian killings. But I think that area is safe from a rocket attack. But they would be counting on the local Muslims, in fact, to do what you were just saying earlier, to go back to the older form of warfare there locally, take up rocks, take up stones, take up guns, and go out into the streets, take up firebombs, Molotov cocktails, and that, and wage the war locally in that phase. But the rest of the country, especially the coastal plain, is definitely what's most in danger from a potential rocket attack, Tel Aviv and Haifa in particular, and they say that out loud all the time.
Yes. It's interesting. I'm taking a group of 60 in June, and I always tell them that I have a direct pipeline to the one who's the author of all this. So this is my 10th consecutive year, and never had, and with the intifadas and the threats and things like that, never seen any of it with our own eyes. And we're usually there during Ramadan, which is quite an interesting time to be in Israel. Well,
and you know, Rabbi Eric, I tell people I lived there 33 years. I still go as you do. I've covered the wars. I run to the terror attack sites. I'm all around it, and yet I was never once in that time assaulted in Israel. Nearly so. I've been shot at. I had a stone thrown at me. My CBS coworker had a cinder block dropped on his head. I pulled him away just in time so it didn't kill him. So we came close, but twice I have been physically attacked. Once in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where I was mugged about 5 years ago and frankly left for dead, unconscious. And about 10 years before that in Los Angeles, I was mugged outside of the airport. So I tell people I find Israel safer than most American cities. I feel more comfortable walking around Jerusalem and that. So, but I do understand why people are concerned now. Certainly, is a greater level of regional conflict than I've seen since I moved there in 1980. It's very, very serious. But of course, this is, as you say, it's the 100th year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration late this year, the 50th anniversary of the reconquest of Jerusalem, the 70th anniversary of the UN Declaration supporting Israel's rebirth. So it's a significant year. It's, of course, also 5,707.
Right.
3 sevens in a row in this year, and coming right after the blood moons. It seems like we could think that there's going to be something very significant happen just on the basis of all of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're talking with David Dolan, Jerusalem reporter, man who lived 33 years in Jerusalem, now residing in Idaho, currently writing, working, researching, keeping his finger on the pulse, reporting for Jimmy DeYoung Ministries, and someone who I have a great deal of respect for his knowledge, his intimate knowledge of his many years in Israel, reporting on these conflicts, and being a biblical worldview, looking at it from the scriptures, from prophecy, not just from the headlines.